So continuing with the Cold War, we had just talked about George Kennan and his ideas on how to contain the Soviet Union, just try to stop the spread of communism as being a strategy for dealing with them. Went and found a political cartoon for you here real quick. I didn't mean to put that piece of blue artwork around it. It happened. I just back with it. But here's Winston Churchill peering under the Iron Curtain. See, it says no order. It says no admittance by order. Joe. That'd be Joe Stalin. And see, the Iron Curtain is literally cutting Europe right in half. See, the railroad tracks just stop right there at it. Okay. So on to our next slide, though. Here's Kennan. We've already talked about that. Next thing we want to talk about is the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine comes around in 1947, and there's two countries that kind of trigger this. Okay. One is Greece. Now, Greece had been captured by the Germans and occupied by the Germans during World War II. Okay. Near the end of the war, the British went into Greece to help kick the Germans out. Okay. What happens is, rather quickly, a kind of a civil war breaks out in Greece. Okay. Because you have to reestablish the government, and there are communist forces who would like to maybe set up a communist government, like what had happened in some of the Eastern European countries as the Soviets went in. And so this little civil war breaks out. And the British are like, really? Seriously? You just got rid of the Germans after 4 years, and now you want to fight amongst themselves? And the British are trying to aid the Greeks. There's pictures here of Greek soldiers fighting Reds, and it's hard to tell in this picture because it's small, but they're carrying British equipment. Okay, so the British are trying to supply forces that are trying to keep Greece from going communist. So that's part one. But the British, they're running out of financial resources after this war. Okay. The second piece of this puzzle involves Turkey. Now, Turkey had set out the Second World War. They had been in the First World War, didn't go that well. Churchill wanted the Turks to try to come in on our side, the Allied side. They wanted to set this one out. Okay. But after the war, the Russians, the Soviets, sometimes I say Russians but the Soviet Union is Russia and several client states, but Russia dominates it. So you can say Soviets is the more accurate term, but sometimes you'll say Russians. Rolls off the tongue easier. But the Soviets would like to have a good warm weather port. Okay. The Soviet Union has ports on the Pacific coasts, the Pacific Ocean and up in the Arctic Circle, but a lot of the ports freeze over in the winter. And they'd like to have a good southern, all-access port. And they have, places like that on the Black Sea. Now, the trouble is the Black Sea is landlocked, okay? But if you can get out, look at this little tiny insert here on this map. Here's the Mediterranean, okay, which goes out into the Atlantic. All right. This little black square is the map here. What the Soviets would like is to have access through these straits here. The Bosphorus Straits, I'm probably mispronouncing that. Goes right through here. Here's a like a satellite photo. Okay, see, they're kind of narrow and skinny. But if the Soviets had control of this, they could send ships out into this little sea, which turns into the Mediterranean, which goes out into the Atlantic. Okay. So the Soviets are putting pressure on the Turks to turn over control of these straits to them. So here is the city of Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. Why is it now Istanbul and not Constantinople? Well, that's nobody's business but the Turks. It's a song, if you know it. I should put it up on canvas. Anyway, the Soviets are putting pressure on the Turks. Don't ask me exactly what they were doing, because honestly, I've never read up on it. I just know that they were doing it. Okay. And the Turks are feeling pressure. And so this is going to lead to the Truman Doctrine. Harry Truman, remember him, he's the president, goes to Congress, and I have a quote here. That's the only time I use the notes is to get exact quotes. He says he asked for $400 million to help Greece and Turkey stand up against Soviet meddling. Okay, because obviously the Reds in Greece are backed by the Soviets. He says, Truman says, quote, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Pause quote. Okay, so armed minorities would be the communists in Greece. Because, I mean, Greece, after all, is the birthplace of democracy, they say. They don't want to go. Most Greeks don't want to be communist, okay? Or outside pressures, that's the Turks being pressured by the Soviets. Okay? Pick the quote back up. He says, I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. End quote. Okay. So this is the Truman Doctrine. If your country is trying to stand up to communist infiltration or subversion, the United States will try to help you. Okay? Just let us know what's going on. This becomes the Truman Doctrine. This is part of containment. Let's not let communism spread into Greece or put pressure on Turkey. Now it's followed up by this is followed up by something called the Marshall Plan. This is a really big deal. Okay. Oh, there's Harry Truman. He's the President of the United States. This is George Marshall. Now, if we were doing a World War II class, and I know it seems like we were, but we weren't, we would have talked about George C. Marshall. He's important in World War II, but he usually doesn't come up in anything other than a dedicated World War II class. But he is the head general of the United States Army during World War II. The only person he really answers to is the Secretary of War, who answers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So George C. Marshall is basically the head of the Army. Okay, the only person, he's the highest ranking soldier. The Secretary of War is not a soldier; that's a civilian job, right? Okay. But he's not a hard-charging battlefield type commander. He's like an organizer, manager working back in Washington, D.C. Now, supposedly, he really wanted to command Operation Overlord. Okay? But Roosevelt says, no, I need you here at home. Too bad. Okay? And so Marshall spends the whole war basically, at the Pentagon running things. Okay? But now he's traded on his uniform for a suit. He's now the Secretary of State. So he's a former soldier turned diplomat. And he's the Secretary of State during this time. And he helps come up with something that they end up sticking his name on called the Marshall Plan. Now, Europe has been torn apart by war. Things have been blown up. Economies are ruined. Bridges and roads and railroads and people are unemployed, and it's just a really bad situation. Now, what kind of people might sometimes try to take advantage of that? Well, that would be communists. Now, prior to World War II, there was a strong communist party in France, okay, for example. And so we don't want those people trying to rise up and say, hey, as long as we're rebuilding our economies, why don't we switch our model from capitalism to communism? So what Marshall basically says, in a nutshell, is if you're economically in trouble, drop the plan, come to the United States, show us what it is you intend to do, and if it looks viable, we'll help bankroll it. This kind of falls under the category if you broke it, you get to help put it back together. Okay? So we'd helped cause a lot of destruction in Europe, so maybe we'll try to piece this thing back together. Okay? Now, my understanding is that, and I'm not an expert on the Marshall Plan at all, but my understanding is that any country could apply for this aid that was war-torn. However, countries behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet sphere of influence aren't going to be allowed to apply for aid from the Americans. You think Joseph Stalin's going to let Poland go to the United States for financial help and makes it look like he can't take care of it. So the Marshall Plan really only affects Western Europe, okay, in the American British zones. All right. But under the Marshall Plan, all kinds of aid flows to Europe. It says here in my notes about at least $12 billion. Okay, countries like France, Italy, Holland help rebuild their economies. Okay, and a lot of this, I know some of it might have been loans, a lot of it might have been gifts. I've never really looked into the Marshall Plan. I should know more about it than I do, actually. Probably be in the book. But billions of dollars. Of course, all this aid's going to go in. I mean, if we're sending supplies, we're going to make sure it says on the crate, courtesy of the United States of America. It's a way to help win people over to, be in our camp and support us in the Great Cold War. So I hopped out when I was getting ready to do this. I found a cartoon real quick that I liked, that I've seen before, and I thought I'd share it with you. Here's a political cartoon. It's the Marshall-Stalin plan. Get it, Marshall-Stalin. Okay. Where's my pen? Sorry about that. The thing timed out for a second. I think we're pushing the limits of my 10-year-old laptop here. Or maybe it's 8 years old. Anyway, here's good old Uncle Joe Stalin right here. See, Joseph Stalin. Okay, and here on the other side of the Iron Curtain, here's somebody driving his brand new tractor, courtesy of the Marshall Plan. Okay, and look at these poor folks. They're like looking over the fence eyeingly here, going, "Man, wouldn't that be great to have one of those?" But Joe Stalin's saying it's the same thing without mechanical problems. Hey, our plow won't break down. And so here's the hammer and sickle. This is the symbol of Soviet Union, international communism. And I looked at this thing for years, off and on, and then like last year, something hit me. Artwork sometimes every so often you look at it in a new way, and it hit me. There's also some symbolism here. Okay, this guy's under the yoke. He's operating under the yoke of international communism. All right, so the Soviet Union will try to help rebuild Eastern European countries, but they don't have the financial strength of the United States. Okay, what they do have is a totalitarian state that can force people to embrace their way of doing things. Great cartoon. I love this one. That's the Marshall-Stalin plan. Another slide coming up, but we're coming up on the time limit on what I can put on YouTube. So let's stop here and pick up in another video with the next slide.